Okay. Good morning and welcome to the third in a series of weekly webinars. I'm Chris Newell and I'll be your host for today. Against the backdrop of an ever-evolving economic landscape, we continue our series of weekly webinars today by discussing the economy in general, government debt and future tax policies. I'm joined by expert speaker Jeremy Mindell, and the webinar will take place in the format of a question and answer session whereby Jeremy will share his thoughts on tax policies going forward and how businesses will need to adapt. The question and answer function is open on this webinar, so please do feel free to submit your own questions in real time. Many of you have also submitted questions beforehand, so we'll try our best to answer these at the end. Before we kick off, I would like to ask for your patience if we do experience any technical difficulties at all during the next hour or so. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Jeremy. Jeremy has partnered with Quantuma for a number of years to deliver a series of enormously insightful briefings following major fiscal events. Jeremy is a chartered tax advisor and was a senior manager at Deloitte before moving in-house to work at AMP and then Henderson Global Investors. So let's start the discussion. So Jeremy, what effect does an anticipated 35% hit to GDP have on the economy in general and taxation in specific?
Well, this follows the sort of the OBR projection. I think it's somewhat on the high side. We've been seeing in the Eurozone sort of drops of 3, 4, 5%. Cumulative, they're talking about 12, maybe 15% drops. But if you were to get some sort of drop similar to what is being talked about, you can look on the next slide to see the VAT position and this massive drop in VAT receipts in March. So this isn't, you know, sort of even before the lockdown fully came into effect on March 23rd, there's this massive drop in VAT receipts. So clearly any form of economic slowdown of the sort that we're looking at will have a major effect on government borrowings. We could be looking at government borrowings anywhere between 200 to 260 billion pounds this year. And that's partly due to the support measures that they put in, the furloughing, the support to businesses, but also the deferral of taxes and more time to pay your VAT, the suspension of business rates for smaller companies, but also because, frankly, the economy will produce a lot less taxation for the government.
Okay. Thank you, Jeremy. Will we face renewed austerity as a result of government debt increasing and a significant projected deficit?
Well, as I said, I think the deficit is going to be uncomfortably high. You know, it's going to be considerably higher than the previous peak. We did have a deficit in 2009-10 of 154 billion. This is going to be projected to be anywhere up to 100 billion more. But I think the government response will be different. And there are a couple of reasons why I think austerity is unlikely to be the major response of the government. Number one, what has been seen in the last 10 years is actually that governments can borrow money much more easily than people thought at much lower rates of interest. We're now looking at the moment at negative rates of interest, which means that people are lending money to the government and they're getting less back, both in nominal and in real terms after inflation. So it's very cheap to borrow money at the moment. And secondly, there seems to be no shortage of people who want to actually lend governments money. You're seeing like pension funds, their immediate response to this crisis is to sell equities and put their money into bonds at a risk reduction strategy. And that means that there's a ready market, and the debt market office of the government is looking to issue a very large number of gilts over the next 2 months, and they don't foresee any problem in getting those gilts away. So that's one reason why I don't think austerity, a renewed bout of austerity will happen. Second reason is I don't think there's that appetite within the public. The public supported, as far as one can see, austerity in 2010 and 2015, but by 2017 general election, there was a definite austerity fatigue. And by 2019, no political party was offering austerity as a long-term measure. And so I'm not sure that the public will wear it. But thirdly, when you move on to the next slide, you'll see that our ability to raise taxes is somewhat limited. I'll come back to that, but some people think the UK is a middle taxing country, a low taxing country, when the truth is actually that we're about middle. We're about at the OECD average for tax to GDP. Tax is a proportion of our economy. If you start moving well to the left of that graph, then you rob the UK of one of its advantages against its European competitors, that it has lower tax rates in some key areas. And I think that the UK would be very loath to get rid of that particular advantage.
Okay. So Jeremy, which specific taxes and sectors are likely to be affected?
Well, one of the things that I would say is, if you look at the next slide, you will see that taxes have gone up since 2014. What you've seen is that taxes have gone up as a percentage of GDP and are converging towards the OECD average. But I do think that there will be some tax changes. What I think the government may do is that what they'll say is, well, the debt that we incur as a result of COVID-19 will be, we'll put it in a box. We'll borrow the money, we'll get the debt management office to issue the gilts, we'll borrow the money and we'll put it in the box. And yes, we'll pay the small amount of interest, but we're not going to look as a sort of short to medium term exercise of repaying that debt. We'll just keep it going. But in terms of what the government may do is they may have a fiscal rule that says we want to get back to taxes at least covering government day-to-day spending, which is what they had before the coronavirus outbreak. So what the government was borrowing before COVID-19 was to fund investment, not day-to-day spending. But if you look at the next slide, what you can see is actually that tax receipts are very high in terms of personal income, income tax and national insurance. The second blue line is sort of VAT and consumption taxes. The third line is business, and the fourth line is capital and other elements. And what you can see is that they're not. There isn't an obvious element in terms of where I can easily raise more money. Certainly not in terms of raising rates of taxation. I think the last time a government raised the rate of income tax was Dennis Healey in 1974. Governments are very loath to raise the marginal rate of tax, certainly in terms of basic rate income tax. They have raised national insurance in the past, but for instance, corporation tax rates have moved down from, they were in the mid-70s, 52%, they moved down to 28% by 2010, and moved down to 19%. I think they'll be very loath to increase those sort of elements because they may have an effect on the economy that is more damaging than the deficit itself. If you look at the next slide in terms of corporate taxes, you can see that corporate tax receipts have increased each year consistently for the past 5 or 6 years, but as a percentage of GDP, they've remained relatively flat. And that's because despite the UK having reduced its rate of corporation tax from 28 to 20 to 19% now, they have expanded the base of corporation tax. So more companies are paying corporation tax. There's more tax levied on, say, non-resident companies. And a number of the allowances, such as interest relief, loss relief, have been reduced, which is how government has raised more money. And that's one of the ways that they could do that. Instead of raising rates, which I don't think they are likely to do very much, I think what they may do is reduce reliefs. And then if you look more widely at the next slide, what you can see is again, comparing us to the OECD. And as I indicated 2 slides beforehand, we raise a lot of money from taxes on personal income, profits and gains. And actually, if you look at the blue line, we raise more than the OECD average on that. Corporate taxes, we raise slightly less, but not hugely less than other countries, because we've already cut back our reliefs more than other countries, even though the actual rate of corporation tax is lower than most other countries. The one area, if you look at taxes on property, which are going to be under considerable pressure as a result of COVID-19, we're already raising much more than double the average of the OECD on property. So I don't see much room for that to go up further. Indeed, there may have to be relief in that area as the property market comes under considerable amounts of strain in commercial property in the high street. The one area where we're an outlier for lower rates of tax is social security contributions. But really, that's the last area I'm going to raise taxes, because higher social security contributions means that it's a huge disincentive to take on staff. And when unemployment is likely to rise as a result of COVID-19, the last thing you want to do is increase employer social security contributions. So again, I would say that the opportunities to raise taxes are considerably less, certainly in terms of rates. And to me, it's no real surprise that when you look at social security, you see at the top of the contribution rates is France, with a much higher rate of social security contributions than ourselves, but they've got double the rate of unemployment. And there is a sort of relationship, in my view, between the two.
Okay. So if the Chancellor did need to raise taxes to maintain his fiscal credibility, where would he look, Jeremy?
Well, over the last 30 years, as I've indicated, Chancellors have found it very difficult to raise rates of tax. But what they look at is all the allowances, all the tax reliefs that they get, which are summarised by HMRC, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, every year. And if you look at the next slide, what you can see is some of the big ticket items on which we give large amounts of allowances and reliefs. So top of the list is registered pension schemes. Now, this is just income tax at 25.6 billion. You'll see in a couple more slides, you'll see that you've got social national insurance savings around another 18 billion pounds as well. So when you add those two items together, we're talking well in excess of 40 billion. Some people believe with other tax reliefs that pensions get, we're talking about close to 50 billion's worth of relief. Now, there have been rumours that governments would restrict pension relief, particularly because the bulk of the individual relief goes to higher and additional rate taxpayers, particularly higher rate taxpayers. And ever since about 2016, there have been plans, but those plans have been shelved. I wouldn't be surprised to see some reduction. There's not going to be an abolition of pension tax relief, but some slicing off of that relief, some reduction there. ISAs is another interesting element. That's a cumulative position. In other words, you know, we've had ISAs for nigh on 30 years, and PEPs and TESAs before that. And with ISAs, perhaps the interesting element with ISAs is, of course, there is no limit to how much you can have in an ISA. You can put 20,000 in a year, but actually with investment growth, you have ISA millionaires already. So it may be an area where the government might put a ceiling on ISAs in the future. Enterprise investment scheme, I think unlikely, because they want to encourage that sort of startup investment. They already had a bit of a crack at termination payments by taking away the NIC relief, which was unlimited and now is limited to the first 30,000. Again, income of charities, I think, is unlikely. So I'd look at potentially pension schemes and ISAs. If you look at the next slide in terms of corporation tax relief, what you can see there is R&D. Well, interesting enough, the Labour Party in their last manifesto wants to get rid of R&D tax reliefs. And the Conservative Party has just, in their manifesto, promised to increase the rate of relief and to increase, they announced in the budget, the scope of R&D tax relief. Given the push for new technology, I don't think that that is likely to go. I think film tax relief, again, is a sector that's going to be hit hard by COVID-19. I think it's unlikely to go. Patent box might be an area that, again, they might look at, especially as the corporation tax rate has reduced from 28 to 19%. The differential between the full patent box relief, giving you CT relief, CT payments at 10%, and the 19% rate is that much less. So you're not talking about the difference between 10% patent box and 28% main corporation tax. Is only between 10% 10% patent box and 19% main rate of CT. So it's possible, I say possible, that they may look at patent box again. But as I indicated in one of the first slides, corporation tax doesn't raise a huge amount of money. One of the areas that they might look at is further restrictions in interest relief. But again, I don't think, when companies are going to have to borrow money as a result of COVID-19, extra money, I'm not convinced they're going to restrict interest relief in the short term, but maybe in the medium to long term, further reductions in the interest relief that companies can get. If you go on to national insurance contributions, this is the second part of the big ticket item on pension schemes, £18.1 billion worth of savings, where employers make direct contributions into registered pension schemes. And there must be at least a possibility that will be looked at. Remember that the Chancellor is given this menu every year. Every year he says, I need to balance the books, I need to give this or that. HMRC come up with a list and saying, well, Chancellor, these are the sort of areas you could look at changing. Employment allowance, well, they increased that from £3,000 to £4,000 as an allowance against secondary national insurance. But they did restrict it to companies who have employer national insurance liabilities in the previous fiscal year of £100,000 or less. So restricting it to smaller companies. They could target that further and restrict it to even smaller companies, maybe put the limit at only £75,000 of secondary NI in the prior year. I could see that happening. It's a possibility, but as I say, it's 2.1 billion. I'm not convinced that it's worth doing that on its own. It could be as a package of other measures. And the third element there, I'm not convinced that they do. So what I've taken is, there's a huge list that is produced by HMRC. What I've taken is the bigger ticket items. The next slide shows capital gains tax, and rather surprisingly, given how little capital gains tax raises in relationship, in relationship to its bigger sisters of income tax and national insurance, the second biggest exemption on its own is actually the principal private residence relief exemption. When you sell your own home that you've lived in all the time, you sell your own home, you don't pay capital gains tax on it if you've occupied the property for the majority of the time that you've been living there. And now the government, at £27.2 billion, if they abolish PPR, they're not going to get £27.2 billion. What would happen is people just wouldn't move home if they have to pay a large amount of capital gains tax. But what the government has been doing rather interestingly since about 2012 is gradually chipping away at the relief, reducing the amount of time you can be outside the home and still get full PPR. So they reduced some of the reliefs that are available in respect of PPR. And indeed, there have been further reductions that took place this month, April 2020, further restrictions in PPR. Not huge amounts of money, but gradually chipping away at this. And you could see that happening in the future. And then the other one which comes up, which I think is interesting, is that for sure HMRC presented in their menu of potential reliefs to be reduced, entrepreneurs relief, costing 2.4 billion. And of course, that was one of the reliefs that was substantially reduced in the last budget, from 10 million to 1 million per person. I don't see it being reduced further immediately, but it is a possibility. It could be reduced to, say, £500,000 relief per person, which would still give a sort of husband and wife family business £1 million of gain at 10%. No, also, they've changed the name. So they've taken out entrepreneurs and they've called it something much more technical. They saw that entrepreneurs relief, gave certain signals and had an emotional connection. And that's, I think, is one of the reasons why it wasn't abolished. The idea of Chancellor abolishing entrepreneurs relief was seen as a political step too far. But now they've changed the name, it makes it much easier for them to get to potentially reduce it further. Okay. Then the final slide, looking at the big ticket items, would be VAT. Now, zero rating of food is just an absolute no-no. They're not going to change that. The last government that tried to change and tax food was the Conservatives in 1906, and they lost by a landslide. And this is a very emotionally and politically important element. I mean, when you see pressure groups like the Institute for Fiscal Studies suggesting that we get rid of zero rating of items, I do think to myself, they're not really living in a realistic political world. That would be complete political poison. Zero rating of construction of new dwellings, again, I think unlikely, but again, it could be slightly shaved or slightly changed in terms of looking at the fact that you repair a building, you pay full VAT, you construct a new building, you get no VAT, you get zero rating. There could be some changes there. When I look down the other elements of the list, I just don't see them changing those very much. I can't see them putting VAT on, say, children's clothing. The one area that they could potentially consider doing might be domestic passenger transport, possibly now that the government has effectively renationalised the railways again. It is possible that they may look at some changes to that. But I'd say within the VAT, I just think, although they're very big numbers, politically very difficult to do. And that goes back to the point that any form of tax rises are very difficult to do and sustain politically.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. So how likely and practical is a change from taxation of income to taxation of wealth going to be?
Well, now it's interesting from the point of view of we've had a number of reports. So we had the all-parliamentary group on intergenerational fairness. We had the Office for Tax Simplification looking at this area, in particular looking at IHT, inheritance tax. But the problem with IHT is that it is really a failed tax, in my view. It is the opposite. You know, that Colbert, Louis XIV's Minister of Finance, famously said that the art of taxation is plucking a goose with the minimum amount of hissing. Well, IHT comes bottom of the chart for that, because with IHT, you get a huge amount of unhappiness about the tax. It's particularly unpopular, and it raises very little revenue in comparison to the big three of income tax, national insurance and VAT, you know, just over £5 billion. And if you look at the major reliefs on the next slide, what you can see is actually, even if you take the major reliefs, the other reliefs I talked about were in billions. These are in millions, you know, 710 million, business relief, business property relief, leaving money to charities, 840 million. Can you imagine them deciding, oh, well, we're going to hit charitable donations by charging IHT on it? Just politically impossible. When you look at sort of business property relief, some people say, well, why is it fair that if I have an unquoted business, I can leave it without IHT? But what people forget is actually valuing these businesses is incredibly difficult. I have a business that is unquoted, therefore there isn't a ready market for that business, and valuation is an art, not a science. You know, what a business is worth, was worth in January of this year, I suspect is probably quite a lot more for most businesses than is what it's worth today. And with an unlisted business, you can't sell the shares, you've got no dividend rights if you're a minority holder, and you've got very limited voting rights. So again, valuing a minority interest is incredibly difficult. And so therefore, whereas they look at potentially there is an element of IHT loss when people pass a business on, two elements that occur. One is if you want business continuity, Mittelstand businesses like they have in Germany, then taxing them heavily through IHT is not a good idea on succession. And secondly, if you look at agricultural property, so farming and so on, again, this is a classic business with lots of assets and not much cash, again, would cause huge distress if you got rid of agricultural property relief. I know they're looking at paying the IHT over 10 years, but, farming is quite a hazardous business. And if you took away that relief, I think you would have a major distress effect on farming. If you go to the next slide and see how much IHT raises, it is unbelievably small. I mean, we are looking at 5 billion quid. For all that trouble, about half of the effort that people make for tax planning is about IHT. The receipts, although they have gone up consistently since 2010 because the limits have been frozen, the 325 main nil rate band was frozen, and property prices have gone up. They are due to plateau, and they have fallen in the last year because of the new residential nil rate band, which was a promise by the Conservatives in 2015, renewed in 2017 and 19, to have £1 million could be inherited by children, including the parents' house, jointly between the two parents. So the idea that an inheritance of £1 million could pass to children from parents was in the manifesto. Breaking that, I think, would be quite difficult. And as you can see, what is the real point of doing that? We are talking about an incredibly small amount of money, 5 billion, as compared to HMRC, I think, raised about 650 billion last year. And as a percentage of GDP, again, you look at those figures, they are incredibly small. Really doesn't make a great deal of difference. So the idea that we're going to repay COVID-19 by a huge wealth tax just doesn't really cut the mustard. And if you look at the next slide, what you can see is that, raises, so their forecast, the OBR's forecast, 5.3 billion in 2019-20, and that is 0.2% of national income. And it takes a long time to do it. I mean, IHT is a very administratively intensive tax, which is why their last information, 2015-16, showed that there were 24,500 estates were liable to IHT, around 4.2% of total UK deaths. So the idea put in the papers that we're going to get rates of 70%, I just think is nuts. I don't foresee an increase in IHT rates. There could be some changes in allowances. But if anybody thinks that's going to come to the rescue of the national accounts, they really do have something else. They really need to look at those figures a little more carefully before coming to those sort of conclusions.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. So how different will the recovery be as compared with previous recessions or other events such as global crises?
Well, I would divide it into two, and you can learn from both of them. One of them is a sort of global crisis such as a war. Now, a war is obviously considerably worse than the current pandemic, although notably in First World War, the Spanish flu came at the end of the First World War and was much exacerbated by the First World War. But there, in a war, you see the destruction of capacity of production, through bombing and invasion and destruction, obviously mass deaths, particularly of the younger, more productive part of the population who are serving in armies and so on. So you would anticipate that something, there's a lot worse than what we've got at the moment, would lead to a prolonged depression. But that wasn't the case either after the First or the Second World War. Economies bounced back relatively quickly, particularly after the Second World War. You note that Germany and Japan, which were pretty much leveled in the Second World War, recover relatively quickly from that, and so from a much worse disaster that befell them. And in the UK and other countries, again, the recovery is based on government policies taken after the war, not necessarily on the severity of the crisis itself. When you look at recessions such as the 1973 oil crisis, or the dot-com burst, or the financial crisis, what I would say is the depth of the crisis is not as important as the government's response to that crisis. Now, the government response to the 2008-9 financial crisis was considerable amount of austerity, or at least control of the public finances. As I said before, I don't think that will happen this time. I think that there will be a concerted reflationary effort, particularly because inflation remains very low. People will want to motor up the economy, and I think that there will be, through fiscal laxity, so in other words, not raising taxes but increasing public spending, potential some selective tax cuts, in my view, and of course pumping money into the economy through quantitative easing. I think there will be a concerted effort by governments and central banks to power up the economy. So I think that this will be a recovery that will happen relatively quickly once the pandemic is under control.
Okay. So, Jeremy, how far can the government now review its tax and spend policies and start from a clean sheet?
Well, there are certain elements where I think that they could say, well, we want to do some things differently. So the fact is that the government is giving, albeit not as much support to the self-employed as employees, it is an unprecedented level of support. And therefore, on that basis, Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, has already said that it is very likely that he will raise national insurance contributions to reflect the fact that the self-employed are getting more support than they have in the past. We may see some changes in terms of tax, the policing of tax, particularly where companies have availed themselves of bailouts, whether it's the furlough or soft loans or so on, more concentration on companies' tax policies to make sure that when the recovery happens, they're paying what is considered a fair rate of tax. But let me move on to the next slide, which shows how difficult the position is. Let's have a look. So some people have said, well, if we're all in it together, let's just massively increase income taxes to, say, 70%, as I think one of your questions came up, somebody was going to ask. Well, the problem is that the top 500,000 people in terms of wealth and assets, that's looking at £150,000 worth of income per year plus £1 million worth of assets. We're talking about those people contributing £54 billion worth of tax. You don't want those people moving abroad or suppressing their income or going into massive tax avoidance. You know, there is a limit beyond which, if you raise rates of tax, you'll either scare off that element of population to either do something else or actually leave the country. Compare that, and the UK system is very reliant on that top 500,000 people. Compare it to the rest of the population on the next slide. What you can see is you've got 45 million people. So that's a huge increase in numbers from 500,000 compared to 45 million. But if you look at that, those other 45 million, the rest of us, are only paying £250 billion in pay-as-you-earn and NIC. So again, you don't want to scare off that top 500,000 people. Indeed, you know, you took a look at the top 1% of the tax-paying population. They are paying 28% of income taxes as we stand at the moment. And so therefore, the government is very conscious of that, as is HMRC. So large tax-raising measures, I think, just won't cut the mustard. And my sort of final point on that would be to say, when we've had sort of crises like the Second World War or the oil crisis, they were followed by the Attlee and then the Attlee government after the Second World War. And they really believed in high taxes, large amounts of government control of the economy, nationalisation, all those sorts of elements. And so it was very easy for them to say, well, we'll just carry on with the sort of measures that we had in the war. After the 1973 oil crisis and the three-day week, and then you had the Wilson-Callaghan government and taxes go up again. That really went with the grain of what they believed in. And if you look, the Wilson-Callaghan government was the last government where the prime ministers had both served in the Second World War. I think the Johnson government, you look at the sorts of people who are at the top, Johnson, Patel, Dominic Raab, Rishi Sunak, these people don't believe in high taxation. They don't believe in the government controlling the commanding heights of the economy. And therefore, I think that they're going to believe we want to get back to more normalcy, as much as normalcy we can. And therefore, I think the idea that they're going to massively raise taxes, I think would be hugely resisted, not just by the public, but I don't think the government believes in it themselves.
Okay. No, thanks, Jeremy. We've had some cracking questions coming in, so please do keep them coming, and I'll try and ask them to Jeremy. So some that we've had coming in, Jeremy. When do you think we'll get back to positive GDP?
Well, I think it depends on the sorry, because of the pandemic. I would have thought that 2021 we should be back to positive GDP, if not before. I mean, it really depends. If we're back to sorry, a more normal economy with some social distancing, people have already shown in the way that they've adapted to this new environment. They've shown some ingenuity already in certain areas. And there you've got sort of the quality of management being shown in some areas and the lack of quality of management in others. So you have seen people finding ways to cope with this problem. And I could see that certainly if you've got a situation where we don't get a massive second wave, we should be into positive territory either late this year or early next year, in positive GDP territory.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. A question that's just come in, do we expect some stamp duty changes?
So stamp duty was one of those elements that Boris looked at or had said, and it was noticeable by its absence in the last budget. I'm not convinced there'll be an immediate change on residential property, but at some point somebody's going to start saying, well, you know, the top rates of stamp duty are too high. We're just not encouraging people to move, not encouraging people to buy and sell properties, and therefore actually it's reducing the income that we're getting. So for the medium term, I think we will see some stamp duty changes, but I don't think in the short term, or I don't think it would be the first thing that I would think of in terms of motoring up the economy. But it is possible, I think, in the medium term to see some changes to stamp duty.
Okay.
But there is evidence that the government is losing out because people aren't moving.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. You've kind of touched on this one, but I think worth asking it again. It may allow a few people on the call to sleep easier tonight. So how high do you think the top rate of income tax will go? 70%?
No, I would say I don't think it'll go higher than 45%.
Right.
If they're going to get higher raters, they'll reduce their pension relief. But again, reducing their pension relief gives you collateral problems, as we've seen with doctors in the NHS and their pension problems caused by that. So it's not an easy solution, but if I was the government, you know, raising the 45% rate sends the wrong message. If it was a Labour government, for sure they would have done it. You know, we've had all this talk about we're all in it together and so on. But I just don't see a Conservative government raising the top rate of income tax. Of course, I mean, my predictions are there to be proved wrong, but it goes against every fibre within a Conservative government to raise the top rate of income tax.
Okay. Thanks, Jeremy. Another question that's come in. Are we looking at a U, a V, an L, a W-shaped recession, or even a Nike swoosh, which is a new one on me?
Right. Well, I think it depends on which sectors you're in. So let's take the one that I can think of as a W would be, for example, when they lift the social distancing rules finally, I reckon every pub, cinema, theatre, concert hall, whatever you name it, people will have gone stir crazy in lockdown for ages. They'll want to go out every night, suddenly there'll be nobody watching TV at home. Everyone will be out. So I could see a sort of recovery, maybe a fallback after that. So there's the sort of outpouring of relief that you may get, and people wanting to socialize again outside and meet people, because I don't think that, the fact is we are naturally gregarious people. We want to meet other people. Well, most people do. So I think that may be a W-shaped recovery in the entertainment industry. Where I think it will be L, i.e. recovery could take an awful long time, would be if I was looking in the airline industry. I don't see that recovering terribly fast, terribly quickly. And I think people will still want to travel abroad, but I think they're more likely to do staycations for a while. And when it comes to business travel, I think companies will clamp down on that. There will still be the need to physically meet people and discuss things and understand how people work. And I'm not taking away from that at all, but I just think it'll be spaced out more. So where you have people who regularly travel, say, every 2 weeks abroad to a particular office, it may be every 4 weeks. And I think you'll see a major cut down in business travel. So in that way, I think that will be L-shaped. But in other parts, I think the general economy, I think as long as we start seeing an easing of some of the restrictions and some of industry getting back together sort of in June, my view is that we will see a stronger recovery than most people think in the autumn and next year. So somewhere between V and U would be my view.
Okay. We're getting quite a few questions coming in now, which is great. So keep them coming. So there's a few bankers on the call, Jeremy, so tread carefully with this one. So any thoughts on whether a windfall tax on banks might be introduced?
I can't see... well, if it was a Labour government, I would say yes, of course. But a Conservative government, let's look at it. Banks don't make a great deal of money when interest rates are very low. One of the real problems in Europe, which could explode at any point, is the fact they've had negative interest rates for so long that banks have not been able to rebuild their capital. And so therefore, the idea that the banks are a sitting duck waiting to have money fleeced from them without affecting the rest of the economy, I think is, again, a very dangerous assumption. And I don't think one that would be swallowed by the government. I don't think they would buy into that. Maybe in the medium to long term, they will look to recover, if banks are seen to make excess profits. But there's no real sign of that at the moment. Banks' balance sheets have been rebuilt. They are making some profits, but I don't think enough to do a windfall tax. And I think they would be more damaging than good.
Okay. Well, thanks, Jeremy. Another question that's come in. Do you expect a return to full employment?
I'm more on the tax side than that. Even in this dreadful pandemic, we've seen certain areas of reductions in staffing. So we're seeing airlines laying off staff. We have seen a considerable increase in the delivery, people required for deliveries and so on. I think it's impossible to say. My belief is that if there is a relatively quick recovery, then yes, we could get back to full employment or something approximating to it. And the idea of the furlough is to ensure that you tide companies over and then they start making decisions about their businesses based on their the future business environment. And it's one of the points that I've made before is that there are certain sectors like airlines where the pandemic will have a major change on the business in terms of, 1 minute it was doing brilliantly and the next minute it's doing dreadfully. But I think with most of the businesses that are going to suffer, there were already signs of stress beforehand. I mean, the number of occasions we've talked about, stress on the high street, well, this has merely reinforced this. When we've talked about digitalization and that sort of way of working, this just reinforces it. So a pandemic like this reinforces trends that were already in the economy. But with very few exceptions, does it really, do a complete U-turn and create something that wasn't present there in the first place? If you're looking at the move towards national champions and protectionism, well, Donald Trump and others have been talking about this for the past 3-4 years. This may accelerate that trend, but it's not creating something that wasn't there before. Where I think there is a big difference is the airlines. But even there, some of the airlines that are looking for bailouts, like Virgin, didn't have any profits, haven't had any decent profits for a good few years. So working on that thesis, we had full employment before the pandemic. There's no reason fundamentally why we can't recover to full employment afterwards. It may take a while.
Okay. This is another question that's just come in, and I think it's quite an interesting one. So in your view, how long is the current furlough scheme sustainable for?
It's a matter of months. What I think they may do to encourage people back to work is, at the moment, the furlough scheme says if you do any work other than your statutory duties as director, you can't have furlough. What they might do is try and encourage people back to work part-time and say, right, you've got somebody, they're on 50% of their time, we'll pay the other 50% or 40%. So I think they'll gradually reduce the support and also encourage people to go back at least part-time rather than this all or nothing approach. So I think furlough could last a few months longer, but I think you'll see it reducing in cost as the government says we'll start going back to work.
Okay. So another interesting question that's come in. So are the forecasts that you've been talking about, Jeremy, do they factor in a potential second wave of COVID-19 and the impact that that would have on the economy?
Given that the best epidemiologists in the world can't factor in what the second wave would be, that is beyond my, I wouldn't even try to do that. I mean, obviously what is being looked at in the UK is building up the capacity for both in terms of the NHS and the testing to deal with a second wave. But I'm going to leave that to the epidemiologists, I think.
Okay, that was a good duck off that bouncer from me, Jeremy. Right, another question that's come in. What impact do you think that we'll see on the residential property market?
So that's an interesting element, and this could include more personal bias. So I'm going to own up to some personal bias here. But all these people where the older people who've been sort of persuaded by their younger relatives to move to sheltered accommodation, to flats without gardens. I just don't think that's going to be terribly attractive. People are going to be worried that this is not the first time, this is not the last time you're going to get this sort of global pandemic. And I think there is a big difference in the quality of life between those who've had access to gardens and those who've not. So my view is that people are going to look more carefully before they give up their gardens. So I think there might be a change in that market. And the density of property. So people have been quite happy or felt that no alternative but to move into flats with relatively small amounts of space. I think people are going to be less happy about that. And you're going to see, I think, a change in balance between the sort of slightly bigger properties and the smaller properties, where people are thinking, well, do I really want to be stuck here for 2 or 3 months when the next pandemic happens, if another pandemic happens? Some people have said that central London flats, if they're small, will become less attractive, and moving out to the countryside, particularly if there's less commuting, will become more attractive. So you could see a bit of rebalancing away from London towards places further away, particularly if the commuting pattern becomes, instead of 5 days a week, 4 or 3 days a week. So, you know, you're able to work from home 2 days a week and you've got 3 days in the office. You might tolerate a longer commute for your 3 days a week. Okay.
Another good question that's come in. Who does the government borrow from, Jeremy?
Well, it borrows from institutions such as pension funds. As I indicated, pension funds have been very keen on de-risking. What do they hold? A lot of government gilts. Individuals hold gilts as well. So it's individuals and institutions, sovereign wealth funds, are quite happy to have low-risk items, low-risk units, not paying a great deal of return, but at least somewhere where you're not going to lose a lot of money. But there's also the printing of money. So quite often, you know, the Bank of England has bought up some of these debts. And that's one of the big differences between, say, the Eurozone, where, you know, like the governments of Italy would like to borrow more and print more, but because it's part of the Eurozone cannot do so, whereas the UK, in control of its currency, can have a much greater coordination between the policies of the government and the policies of the central bank. And that's a stress and strain where I think we're going to see more interesting news in Europe in the months to come.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. Another political hot potato one now for you, so stir yourself. So does the proof of the technology working from home prove that continuing with HS2 is a crazy idea?
I have thought about that. My answer is no, because it doesn't prove it's a crazy idea, because we don't know what the new normal will look like in terms of travel. So let's go back to my previous point about, let's say people commute 3 days a week. What you could see is that if I'm only traveling 3 days a week, I'd be prepared to put up with longer journeys from longer distances. So it's quite possible that people will commute for 3 days from, you know, places up, you know, HS2, where you're talking about a 2-hour journey. So I'm not sure that it totally shows that HS2 is a crazy idea from that point of view. And I think that the element of what you're looking for is how much will people still rely on face-to-face? And I think really with big meetings and crucial meetings, whilst we are all forced to be in lockdown at the moment, if you were given the choice and you had something really important, you probably want to be in the same room as the people you're negotiating with, the people you're dealing with. And therefore, you know, a lot of people have talked in the past about we don't need railways. A classic example on that route, which I've talked about before, is that Milton Keynes was founded in the 1960s. And when Milton Keynes was founded, it was thought they didn't need a railway station. And it was only in 1982 that they actually got round to building a railway station in Milton Keynes, because they said, well, actually, you know, we now believe railways still have a future. So I think that looking at the pandemic and at this stage, to make a judgment on HS2 would be premature. I think you would have to wait and see what the new normal is.
Okay. Another fairly political one that's just come in. Do you see this as a death knell of the EU?
No, I don't see it as the death knell of the EU. Why don't I see it as the death knell of the EU? Because the EU has shown in the past that they will do whatever it takes, even ignoring the economics, to keep the EU together. You know, I was in a room with a bunch of fund managers in about 2009-10. I remember the occasion. And over 2/3 of fund managers in that room, you know, intelligent people, thought that Greece would be out of the euro within months. And Greece didn't leave the euro, not because there wasn't an economic reason that they shouldn't have left the euro, but because at the bottom resort, the European Union will do almost anything to keep a member state in there, short of sending in the army. And therefore, don't underestimate the political will to keep things going. Having said that, if there's always a possibility that something completely unforeseen would make the whole thing crack up, but I just don't see it. Politicians across continental Europe have invested far too much in the European Union to see it just break up. So I don't think that will happen. And, you know, what the European Union has shown in the past is that they're prepared to inflict considerable amounts of pain in order to keep the project going.
Okay, super. Thanks, Jeremy. And I'm just conscious of time. There was thanks just on that particular question, sort of great answer. So a bit of feedback for you there, Jeremy. So I'm just going to wind things up now. So thank you very much to all those that have joined us. We hope you found the webinar useful. Over the course of the next few weeks, we're running a series of webinars on various topical issues. So please do continue to join us. Details will be sent to you in due course, so keep a lookout. For any questions we didn't have time for, we'll follow up with you individually to discuss. And lastly, thank you, Jeremy, very much for taking time out of your day to share your knowledge, expertise and experiences. So have a good day, everybody, and stay safe.